So I just want to welcome you all. My name is Vicky Ozake. I'm with Humboldt Asians and Pacific Islanders in Solidarity. I'm so pleased that you all came today. I wanted to thank Josh Buck and Dana Fretzi for the new executive director of the Clarke Museum. Thanking for opening the space. They've had a very chaotic week with a Victorian tea and talks and all sorts of things here. They were cleaning up this morning and they opened it. Today is a closed day typically for the museum. So it's very nice that they opened their doors for us.
Happy to help. Make it happen.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much. And then I also wanted to thank Jay Tillman back there with the Marsh Project. He's recording this, and so it's a live stream, and then there'll be a recording afterwards. So if you know people that missed the talk, then they'll be able to see it. And so I'm here today to introduce Debbie Chinn. And I have her bio, so just to do it justice, I'm reading it because my bio would be like 2 sentences. She has lots of accomplishments, and I want to get it right. So I'm going to read through this very quickly before her talk. So Debbie, over the past 30 years, Debbie has been the executive director of the Opera Parallel, the Carmel Bach Festival, the managing director of the California Shakespeare Theater, the Baltimore Center Stage, and the Shakespeare Theater of New Jersey. She was engaged as a consultant by the Philadelphia Orchestra to support the acquisition of international corporate sponsorships and the planning of global exchange programs associated with the inaugural China Residency Initiative, which launched in Beijing, China in May 2012. And that coincided with the 40th anniversary of President Nixon's historic visit to the People's Republic of China. Debbie is currently the managing director for Anna Devereaux Smith's pipeline project called Girls, which is a 2-year project fueled by questions that require new forms of engagement with communities. The end goal is a fictional play about the vulnerability of young women and non-binary individuals who live in American communities torn apart by violence and generations of poverty. This is a sequel to Smith's play, film, and book called Notes from the Field. Debbie is also on the boards of the Playwrights Foundation, the San Francisco Community Music Center, the Chinese Cultural Center of San Francisco. She's on the Advisory Council and on the EDI Committee of the West Edge Opera. She most recently served on the board chair of the Theater Bay Area, and on a national level, she's been appointed to the Leadership Council of the National Small Businesses Association. And on top of that, she also serves on the Health and Human Services Committee, which oversees all human resources and labor issues. She is also, on top of all of that, involved in transformative leadership work in the realm of community engagement. And she's featured in Creative Soul Change, Leadership for a Healthy World, which is part of this International Leadership Association series, and assembles thought leaders to reimagine leadership in building a healthy, sustainable, and equitable world. And more recently, Debbie has ties to the area. I had a wonderful opportunity to spend time with her yesterday, Sherry Wu and I. And she most recently was up here completing this project, the Pipeline Project Girls. And so she was working with young local indigenous women. And also partnered with Jackie Danino at the Arcata Playhouse and with Judge Abby and the York Tribe. And just so pleased that she's here with us for Hoppy. She currently is serving as a creative consultant for the writer William Kingsolving on the development of his new musical, That Week with the Box, and that will be presented in San Francisco, February 2023. So she's an amazing, accomplished woman, and I'm really happy to introduce her. I'm very delighted that she's going to be talking about her book, Dancing in the Light, A Daughter's Unfinished Memoir. It came out in March 2022, so just this spring. So hot off the press. And I'll let her talk. I mean, the whole will be about that.
Want to say anything, Josh? Thank you, Vicki.
Yeah.
Hi there, folks. My name is Josh Buck. I'm the new executive director here at the Clarke Museum. Just wanted to say thank you very much for coming out today. It's wonderful to see many familiar and then new faces as well. So I really hope that you enjoy your Debbie Chinn for not only writing this book, here in Eureka. And I think it's history that really needs to be discussed. My goal of getting that out to more local educators. So I'm really on board with everything that this project is doing. And with that, I will turn it over to Debbie.
Thank you,
Thank you all very much.
Welcome aboard. We represent height diversity, he and I, so. Sure. Well, it is a great pleasure to be. I am really humbled to be here, truly humbled. I am at Ground Zero in Eureka, where there once was a thriving Chinatown, where the Chinese contributed to various growing industries here, mining, lumber, agriculture, you name it. And where we were also culturally, physically, spiritually, emotionally castrated, just for being Chinese. So I'm here on the site where the massive and perpetual waves of Chinese expulsion occurred, where hate and fear and racism and oppression ruled. But I'm also here where the seeds of redemption have been sown, where hate slowly gave way to resiliency and acceptance, and where the work of Hapi and scholars such as Jean Felser, whose book Driven Out exposed the harrowing era of intolerance here, where we must never, ever forget, and where the Asian and Pacific Islanders are reclaiming visibility in the refusal to be culturally erased. I had the great pleasure of having a tour of the Chinatown Historical Project yesterday, thanks to Vicki, and it is one of the capstones in this endeavor and a potent example of the strength of community solidarity to come together to fight against oppression. Asian hate is nothing new. We have to keep at it, keep fighting it, and this group is doing a remarkable job of exposing the history here that very few people know. And Jean's book, Driven Out, if you have not read it, it is a must read. It is a harrowing read and brilliantly put together. I'm just honored that Jean is here. She's the expert. I'm not a scholar. I'm just telling a story about my family. But I also want to thank Marilyn and all the aunties and the founding mothers of Hapi for your kind invitation to be here today, to the Clarke Museum to be here in this very important place where history is preserved. And I also want to acknowledge that we are in the land of the Wiots. I spent time, as you know, in the Eureka community and with Lauren, who helped feed us with her wonderful food. So this is truly coming back home for me. Now, as for me, my book is called Dancing in Their Light. And those four women on the cover, from left to right, the left is my great-grandmother, my other great-grandmother, my mother's mother, and the woman on the far left is my mother. As for me, I grew up while other children played sports and did summer camps, and where my childhood was spent in the world of my family's very successful restaurant and nightclub called Mahjong Restaurant on Long Island, New York. And both my parents worked at the restaurant, which is very rare in those days to have both parents in the workforce. So for me, my first job was at the age of 3. And I sold cigarettes to customers. We didn't have a vending machine. My mother just had cartons of cigarettes and just told me to arrange them all on the counter. And I did, and I loved the smell of it. And so my mother got a little worried. So by the age of 6, she took me away from selling cigarettes. And I graduated to putting toothpicks and cherries and pineapples at the bar. And I handed out sugar cubes to people just to draw them into the bar. And my father said, don't move, stay there, because you're good for business. Because people would come and talk to me, and they'd sell more drinks. So by the time I got into first grade, I'd been in the workforce for 4 years. So, and I had no idea that those two experiences, hanging out at a bar, chatting, would be a through line to becoming a CEO. But my book is about those Mahjong days and of an era long gone. We will never see that era again. And it's about my family of Chinese immigrants and their incredible journey testing resilience and fate. This is the part of the introduction of my book that helps tease this talk. Growing up at a restaurant, at a nightclub, selling cigarettes at the age of 3, working as a bartender's helper at the age of 6, and spending my weekends performing as a hula dancer during my teenage years are naturally good fodder for a memoir. There aren't many people whose childhood was like mine, where I learned how to walk on fire and dance with sharp knives. I was reminded of all of this when I discovered my father's memoir about the history of our family restaurant and how it rose to great acclaim in Syosset, New York, on Long Island. It's a suburb. Syosset's a suburb. That's the letterhead, and that is the interior of the restaurant. But I scanned through Dad's memoirs many times after you finished it, and I thought nothing of it until I started to, I think I had a martini and I started posting some stories on Facebook, and people responded with comments about how much they remembered about my family's restaurant. There were 400 posts that came in from just putting something about a picture of my childhood. And these conversations contain stories of their remembrances of Mahjong, people I never knew. And they remembered what the food tastes like, the waiters' names, what it smelled like, what spare ribs smelled like, coming out of the kitchen. They remembered the bartenders. They remembered everything. I just couldn't believe it. And they remembered my parents' warm hospitality, above all. And so I responded by offering more comments and stories about what it was like to grow up in Mahjong. And I received requests to send more stories. So encouraged by these responses, I set out to write a book about Mahjong's distinct personality and of a bygone era when dining out together as a family was a weekly tradition, when restaurants had private phone booths and coat check rooms, and where men wore hats and women wore gloves and children had manners, as well as a golden age of Polynesia, Polynesian floor shows, so ubiquitous in the 1960s and 70s. So how did a simple Chinese restaurant like ours grow to be so ingrained in people's memories throughout all these years? So I set out, to find out what was about the restaurant that engendered decades of customer loyalty, what was unique about our family's business model that's missing in today's workplace. And a book about my family's restaurant is incomplete without the story of my parents and our family elders, whose lives were uniquely chiseled by the effects of war, starvation, hatred, diseases, tragic loss, mystery, and divine opportunities. Another resurgence of anti-immigration vitriol surfaced in 2017. National discourse accelerated towards the building of walls, the deportation of immigrants and families and children. The COVID-19 pandemic ensued. It was referred to as the Kung Flu virus, or the Chinese virus by Donald Trump, fueling the rise of vulgar racial slurs and hatred against the Chinese. And I watched news reports of Asians, particularly the elderly, women, young, systematically targeted and beaten and killed on the streets of America with alarming frequency. And I began to believe that we were on the precipice of another dangerous chapter in US history and the possible return of the Chinese Exclusion Act, or any new congressional act designed to ban immigrants, especially those of color, from coming into the United States. So I reshifted the balance to highlight more of the stories of my own family of Chinese immigrants who came here and who brought with them specialized skills and connections, a spirit of invention, all of which greatly contributed to this country's economic growth and reputation in the field of science, engineering, medicine, aerospace, nursing, research, higher education, cultural diplomacy, artistic heritage, culinary hospitality, all throughout the 20th century. That's just my family. My family played a sizable role in advancing humanitarian endeavors, and I wanted to tell their stories so that we remember an era not that long ago when the United States and China enjoyed a cordial bicultural relationship. We were not the enemy then, and we're not the enemy now. And my research also traced a portion of my family beginnings in China to the Southern Baptists. I've got Southern roots. And I learned that my family name is actually Hartwell. This is the man who started my family. His name is Jesse Boardman Hartwell Jr. He was a Southern Baptist missionary born in South Carolina, but who found a calling to be stationed in China to share the message of salvation with the Chinese people. He was the one who organized the first Protestant church in China, just north of Shanghai. And this was all during the time of the Taiping Rebellion in 1851 to 1864. And it was during that time when a young mother and her young daughter were fleeing that rebellion and found haven in a church. The mother died, but the young girl was still very much alive, and she had a great set of lungs as she was crying loud enough for Jesse Hartwell to hear her. And Jesse found her, he adopted her, he gave her the name Mary Hartwell, and Mary Hartwell is my great-grandmother. And here's a picture of Mary Hartwell. She's to your right, second to the right, sitting next to that very big man who is her husband, Yu Jung Kwo, K-W-O-H. They got married, and they had 3 boys. The 3 boys are standing behind them, and that little boy in the middle is my grandfather, Frank. And Frank married a woman named Kate, and they had 7 children. And that is a picture of my mother, who's on the right, on the right of this picture to your left, and all of her siblings. So there was 6 girls and 1 boy. And take a look at that picture and just remember it, because that is one of the few photos that exist of this family intact together before circumstances of war pushed them all out and caused the separation of our family. For the older ones, what forced them out of China was the Japanese occupation of China in 1937. And for my mother and the 2 younger ones, the one in the middle and the one on your far right, standing next to Frank, it was the communist takeover of China. So they did not have a whole lot of time to be together as a family. But the Sino-Japanese War, which started from 1937 to 1945, during those 8 years, my mother and her 2 younger sisters, the one in the middle is Edie and the one on the far right is Daisy, they subsisted on a diet of potatoes and cabbage, which was all they could afford. Cooking oil was rationed and expensive, so my mother learned how to stir-fry potatoes in water. And her sister Daisy would make a meal the next week of boiling potatoes in water. And when it was the young Edie's turn to make dinner, she stir-fried cabbage in water. The sisters tried to grow vegetables, but the ground was too tough to yield any growth. And my Aunt Daisy remembers that the coaxing of the soil brought turnips, finally, turnips. But everybody in the region was starving, so it was very common for people to steal vegetables. And so the sisters just gave up. Now, my mother and her young sisters were educated and they got jobs, but the money they earned was still not enough to buy food. And the only thing they could afford was substandard rice or millet deliberately mixed with sand, which is basically inedible. And this was a time of profound despair for these young girls and their mother. Their family had been torn apart. All the elder siblings left to come to the United States, and the routine of going to school was dangerous. They couldn't come out of their home. And so my mother often talked about the hardships of that time and the sadness of that lifespan. And I asked her what it was like. She was 14 years old when all of her other siblings left, and she was left to take care of the 2 younger ones, ages 12 and 10, and her ailing mother. Frank, by this time, he found a concubine, and the concubine was my mother's high school classmate. So Frank went off with his concubine, and he left the hometown of Qingdao, where my parents my mother is from, and so he separated. So my mother was alone with her 2 siblings and her ailing mother. And when I asked my mother, how did you get through those dark days? She said they found solace in singing and reciting poetry and dancing and doing anything that their imaginations would allow to get them through that tough time. And I remember that the power of art to move through trauma is something that has moved me into my career. So flash forward, and these are the 3 older sisters and their husbands and their young kids. after they've come into the country. I just want to tell you a little bit about just the three girls, the three older sisters, and what they did and what their husbands did to advance the fields that I just mentioned. The older sister, her name is Mamie, and her husband's name is Si Xuan, and they call him SC for short. But Mamie became a professor at Cornell University, School of Nursing, where she developed the comprehensive training for nurse practitioners. This is brand new at the time. Her expertise in the field was cited in the American Journal of Public Health and American Journal of Nursing. And her research papers, research papers in that time, were published and supported by grants by the US Public Health. There was also an organization, I don't know whether you know, Josh, called ABMAC. It was called the American Bureau for Medical Advancement in China. It no longer exists. But it was a significant organization designed to give aid to medical and public health services in China. And between 1937 and 1945, China received more than $10 million from ABMAC. And Mamie was an architect of moving money to ABMAC to help the medical students in China. And so the following year, when they got their travels and everything ready, my Aunt Mamie and Uncle SC were going to go back to China, and they had intended to set sail on December 12, 1941, to go back to China, help China rebuild after the Japanese occupation. But then what happened? Pearl Harbor, December 4th. So when that happened, Mamie and SC decided they would stay in the United States. They wanted to use their know-how, their connections to make this country better, to help this country get through what had just happened in Pearl Harbor. So they decided they wanted to come here and be the best Americans they can be. That was their goal. SC, meanwhile, focused his research on motion sickness, and he became an expert on the brain stabilization functions. So he was hired by NASA to study the problem of nausea in astronauts as they battled motion sickness. And he was responsible for the invention of the vomit comet. The vomit comet is, you probably have seen it. Who's seen Apollo 13? Okay, so Ron Howard trained the actors to experience weightlessness in the vomit comet. So according to this is what the vomit comet looks like. You're weightless, right? And according to the New York Times, they cited my uncle's research as this. His research led to a fundamental understanding of motion sickness and the development of drugs to prevent vomiting and other adverse reactions. It also opened the windows to other kinds of deviations from normal functions and led to effective countermeasures like drug therapy for hypertension, also morning sickness. So this is what my uncle advanced in the United States that's still very much used today. Whenever you see astronauts taking off or pilots taking off, they go through this training that my uncle developed. A little bit about the second sister, Bertha, who married a man named Paul Meng, M-E-N-G. And this is the story of the China Institute in New York. I don't know whether you are aware of that. But the China Institute gained a reputation for a membership-based organization designed to create bicultural relationships between the United States and China. It was established in 1926 by two Chinese educators to address the absence of a reciprocal understanding between these two countries. 1926. Startup funding for China, the China Institute, can be traced back to the Boxer Rebellion and the reparations issued to countries whose embassies and missionaries were killed while in China by the Chinese rebels. The United States was one of the countries which received compensation, but American diplomats and educators lobbied to return the funds to China to invest in their education system. President Theodore Roosevelt authorized the first remission of funds, and subsequent funding allowed the China Institute to be established in New York. And my Uncle Paul was the director of that for 37 years. The China Institute he traveled extensively throughout China in 1936, interviewing over 2,000 graduates of American colleges and universities. And these findings are detailed in the documentary Glimpses of Modern China, which would permanently help reframe the education system for many Chinese Americans and Chinese international students in the United States in the 1920s. He is a direct descendant of Mencius, for those who don't know. Mencius was a colleague of Confucius. And so my uncle is the 73rd descendant of Mencius. Sadly, that line ends in my generation because Paul's son, the last of the sons, died prematurely at the age of 39 with no heirs. So sadly, the line ends in my generation. But Mencius expounded the teachings of Confucius and a philosophy that tolerates all religions to keep an open mind. So tolerance, love, that was the culture that my family, along with that side of the family in particular, embraced. But Paul was a longtime friend of the Henry Luce family. Anybody know the Henry Luce family? Dr. Winters Luce was an American missionary born in Shantung province, the same province as Paul and the same province as Jesse Hartwell. And Henry Winters Luce and his wife Elizabeth Middleton had 4 children. One of them you may know is Harry Luce, who was the founder of Time magazine. I don't know whether you know that Harry Luce married Claire Booth Luce, the playwright who wrote The Women. But Harry Luce was the founder of Time, and he was the one that helped donate all the funds to give the China Institute its new building in New York City. And the grand opening of this building was celebrated on August 27th, 1944. It was the 2,495th anniversary of the birth of Confucius. And in this picture, my uncle is to the right. The woman in the middle, the doyenne, is Miss Luce, and Henry Luce is next to my uncle in the back. But at the invitation of my Uncle Paul, opera singer Marian Anderson was asked to perform 2 spirituals. My soul is anchored in the Lord, and sometimes I feel like a motherless child. She donated her time and her services because she knew my uncle was very much a proponent and a supporter of Black educators in colleges at that time, before it was even fashionable to do this. Under President Roosevelt, China was not considered a global enemy, nor vilified by the United States. And on the contrary, many American sons and daughters of those missionaries in China returned to the United States with an interest in raising awareness and appreciation for Chinese history and cultural understanding. Among the many missionaries who impacted my family was Claire Booth Luce, Henry Luce, and of course Pearl S. Buck. Uncle Paul rose in prominence. He became an international expert in Chinese-American cultural relations, a nascent relationship at the time. This is the time when China was still very foreign. Imagine here was Jean writes in her book, imagine the impact of the numerous expulsion acts across the country at that time. But at the same time, he became friends with politicians and scholars such as Sidney Gamble, who was the grandson of Procter & Gamble's founder, and they formed a formidable board of trustees for the China Institute. Today, the China Institute is the oldest Chinese bicultural nonprofit in America. And again, my uncle ran it and built it for 37 years until he retired. Talk a little bit, getting into some food stuff here. This is my uncle, the only brother in the man in the family, and he married a woman named Emily. But my Uncle Teddy was a civil and structural engineer, and he was responsible for building and creating structural designs for some of the most recognizable buildings. You probably recognize this project of his, the old TWA building at Kennedy Airport. And if you look at that structure, you think, how do they keep it all together? Well, my uncle designed that feat of engineering. It's now a hotel, by the way. They saved the building. My Aunt Emily was establishing herself as a prominent restaurateur in Manhattan, and she introduced a broader range of Chinese cuisine. She was from Shanghai, and her restaurant menus reflected the northern Chinese cooking, unheard of in the United States. But in a little-known fact, according to a 1967 New York Times article, the now classic mushu pork, a staple dish of North China, was first introduced by my Aunt Emily to the United States. Her further contribution to the culinary field included numerous commercial kitchen devices and her invention of what was a reversible and multiple cooking oven, steamer, grill, and griddle. There was a patent for that. And we come to my Aunt Daisy, my mother's younger sister. During the United States, she established a very prominent career in teaching. During the United States, during the global commitments, there was a need for foreign language education programs and instructors. And through the China Institute, my Aunt Daisy was referred to the Army Language School in Monterey. The most requested foreign language was Russian, followed by Chinese. There was a need for American servicemen to learn how to speak those languages. So my Aunt Daisy taught Mandarin to the US Army students. The Army Language School is the precursor to what is now the Defense Language Institute. But at that same time, Yale University had started a Yale Institute of Far Eastern Language. So she was recruited by Yale in 1955 to begin her 17-year career as a Chinese language and history teacher. And in the United States, from 1951 to 1965, through the presidencies of Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson, the United States Air Force contracted with Yale University for training these languages for Cold War intelligence. In that 14-year period, over 3,000 airmen completed their intensive language courses, primarily in Chinese. And my Aunt Daisy was central to developing the training for nearly all of them. So let's talk about my family. My dad, let's face it, my father came here illegally. China had just become a republic in 1912, and he was 3 years old at the time with an unstable government, and his mother sent him to the United States when he was just 15. And she sent him to Seattle with the goal of getting to his older brother who had been in Buffalo, New York. Buffalo, New York had a large Chinese population at that time from southern China. The only way to get from Seattle to Buffalo was by train. Chicago businessman George Pullman had created the Pullman Porters, former black slaves who had left the South after the Civil War and during the Reconstruction era of 1865 to 1877. So Pullman hired them to serve white customers in the luxury rail cars. And by the 1920s, the Pullman Company was the largest employer of black men in the United States. And the rising anti-Chinese sentiment in the US found a resonant chord with these Pullman porters who understood the Chinese plight of racism and persecution. And my father tells the story about taken under their wings, he was kept hidden from sight on the rail cars and allowed to take the train cross country. And through the kindness of the porters who sheltered and fed him, Dad was able to get from Seattle, Washington to Buffalo for free. And my dad's job, as he said, was at the end of the night that he swept up all the cigarette butts and he'd unravel the unused tobacco, and he and the porters would put them in new papers and they'd smoke them. So my father came here with a 5th grade education. He didn't know English, but he graduated from high school. He was elected president of his chemistry class. He went to NYU, and he enrolled in Harvard Business School. And then he became a Marine to serve this country. And that's when he was stationed in China and where he met my mother. And he was a captain of intelligence. So he was very well aware that Mao Zedong was about ready to seal the borders. He was very well aware of the communist power at that time. So with that advantage, he got my mother and her mother and my sister, who was born in China, and out of the last military ship leaving the port of Shanghai for San Francisco. And this is the picture of them on Chinese soil for the last time as a family. That's my young father and my mother holding my baby sister, and Kate, my grandmother. But as in China, when they came here, they endured hardships. They were not welcomed here. They were just not welcomed here. They settled in San Francisco. They raised a family. They had a boy named Lowell. And the pandemic at the time was tuberculosis. And my mother contracted it, and she inadvertently gave it to her son, who died at the age of 15 months. And my mother had to undergo an operation to remove her infected lung. That's what you do, you get rid of the lung. And she was sent to recuperate in one of the many sanatoriums. This one was in Redwood City. And the book talks about the migration to what was eventually our home base on Long Island. And I want to jump ahead and tell you a little bit about that. So Long Island is a suburb of New York City. Where we lived is in the area shaded in green. New York City is that little sliver of an island next to that orange blob known as Queens. But we moved there. And Long Island at the time was not only homogenized, but the first suburb of the United States was built by a man named William Levitt. Levittown is on Long Island, not too far from where we grew up in Syosset. And Bill Levitt had a covenant that refused to sell to any black people. This is what he wrote. I have come to know that if we sell one house to a Negro family, the 90 or 95% of our white customers will not buy into the community. This is their attitude, not ours. We can solve a housing problem, we can solve a racial problem, but we cannot combine the two. And that is the environment that welcomed my family on Long Island. It was inhospitable to any person of color, so I never saw people of color growing up. But also at that time, Long Island was famous for growing potatoes. And upon settling on Long Island, my father was encouraged, in order to be accepted and welcomed, join the Kiwanis Club, because their mission is to be welcoming, supportive of business people. And so one of my dad's connections in the Kiwanis Club, he owned a whole bunch of potato fields. That's what Long Island looked like. That's a long time ago. And so one of his connections owned a potato field that had not yet been sold to that racist man, Bill Levitt. And so the president of Long Island National Bank, a member of the Kiwanis Club, took a liking to my father and gave him the money to buy an old potato barn for $60,000. Just handshake, give me the money when you can, no paperwork. That's how they did in those days. And so the restaurant became the House of Mahjong Restaurant. It opened in 1960, which is the year of the mouse, or the year of the rat, the first zodiac animal in the Chinese zodiac. And this is the opening. That's the banker next to my dad with the white coat. And so my mother and father's approach to business was simple. They were so grateful to have come to this country, surviving all that they went through, and they tried to treat staff and customers and the community with respect and to give opportunities to their staff. They sponsored Chinese cooks coming over from China. My father built a secret dormitory in the basement to house them. He couldn't find a place to put them in apartments because nobody wanted Chinese people in the community. So he had to put them underground in the basement. And I talk about what it was like to go in that basement. It was quite scary. But it was sort of like a gambling den in there as well. But for my research, they eventually became very successful restaurateurs. And over time, the food was so good, everything was just, they were so into supporting the community. The restaurant was across from Syosset Hospital. And without fanfare, my mother and father would drop off cartons of food for the nurses and the interns working the graveyard shift. When my mother heard that a customer had a child that was going through surgery, my mother would bring a toy to leave at the desk for the child when he got out of surgery. Those were the things that my parents did to just give back. But we started to do some research, and so Mom and Dad loved to take us out to restaurants, and so we started going to the city, New York City. And a special treat was going to Trader Vic's. When you went to Trader Vic's at the Savoy Plaza Hotel, it was on 5th Avenue and 58th, you were transported into the land of Polynesia. The decor was tiki torches and giant clamshells and fishing nets and bamboo partitions, rattan seats, a large outrigger canoe, you name it. From 1937 to 1966, at the Lexington Hotel, the Hawaiian Room featured singers and dancers recruited from Hawaii to perform during their luau's. It was known as the Hotel Lex. Perhaps the most famous of all the Polynesian restaurants in New York, and a fixture at Times Square, which was above the Winter Garden, was Hawaii Kai. It was established in 1962 by a man named Joseph Kipnis, who was a Broadway producer, whose credits included High Button Shoes with Phil Silvers and Annette Fabray. And he did a string of productions, Applause with Lauren Bacall and Mac and Mabel with co-producer David Merrick. And through Kipnis's theater connections, he engaged the services of a man named Frederick Fox. Fox was a set designer for the Metropolitan Opera. And he was responsible for the set and lighting design, and he designed the dramatic interior of Hawaii Kai. Greenery, waterfall, capuchin monkeys, the Lounge of Seven Pleasures, and Polynesian entertainment in those days went on until 3 in the morning. It was just nonstop entertainment. So the area that encompassed Hawaii Kai, Trader Vic's, and the Lexington Hotel highlighted a rich Polynesian island experience in the heart of Manhattan. Part of a nationwide spurt in an interest in Hawaii, which became a state in 1959, was the 1963 exhibition of Disneyland's The Enchanted Tiki Room. The Rodgers and Hammerstein musical South Pacific opened on Broadway in 1949. The movie adaptation premiered in 1958. James Misch's Hawaii was first published in 1959, and the Flower Drum Song was directed by Gene Kelly. And Gene Kelly and my family have a connection because he recruited Polynesian dancers for our nightclub, and 2 of the dancers in Flower Drum Song became dancers at Mahjong. The Ala Moana Shopping Center in 1959 on Oahu, a new shopping experience touted as the largest open-air shopping center in the world at that time. Phase 2 opening in 1966 would feature live Polynesian entertainment. So completely swept up in this national fascination with Hawaii and Polynesia, our family went to California and Hawaii for a research trip in 1966. And our trip to Hawaii was transformative. It fostered among my family and me an abiding love for the connection with Polynesian culture. It was also the catalyst for Mahjong 2.0, because business was so robust and the little potato bar was bursting at the seams. We needed to expand. And so a Polynesian nightclub was added. And my father worked with architects to create this stunning new facade, floor-to-ceiling windows with beams that give a hint of a pagoda. And this is what the outside looks like. That's what it looked like when it was finished. Have a look at all that stone. Transforming the building from a bar into a restaurant was a remarkable feat. Each stone was manually inlaid piece by piece by a company called Antival. Laborers that shoveled piles of rock, sorted them, cutted, measured them, installed them. That's a picture of my father and my brother with the workers there. You can see in the foreground, all those rocks were shaped, custom fitted to be in the facade. So that is a building that was designed by, there's no other building in the world like it, by the way. So by the time it was done, we had a new Aloha room, a Polynesian nightclub, and it looks a lot like Trader Vic's, doesn't it? And the entrance to the Aloha room was framed by a bamboo archway, dark redwood bamboo walls, tikis, you name it. And a funny story is that we were so enthralled that my father renovated our house, and we had the exact same look in an extension of our room. And it became the second Aloha room, and my sister was in college when this whole new extension of our house came about. And she came back, and suddenly it was like the restaurant. She said, "I had no idea Hawaii threw up while I was gone." But so it just became this very famous nightclub. Everybody went there, and I talk about all of that in the book. So I went from selling tobacco and being at the bar to becoming a hula dancer. I do not look like that anymore. And the rest of Dancing in Their Light describes my growing up years in the nightclub, where there was the mob, there were nuns, there were priests. My father loved gambling, and he would, when everybody went away, he would convert the whole dining room into a gambling den. All the waiters came out with their dominoes and their cards and the liquor, and I tell the story about how my father was so fixated with gambling, he didn't come home one night and didn't tell my mother. My mother was the original badass woman. And so my mother wrote on the wall when he came home in magic marker, "Did not come home tonight." And he just looked at it and went to bed. That got her, had her mad. And then he did it again. And I remember going to school in the next morning, and I saw on the curb piles of my father's pants on the curb, all with the crotch cut out. That was my mother. And I also tell the story about in the leader of the band said, "What would you like to do to celebrate your 25th anniversary, Nellie and Peter?" She asked my mother, "What song would you like us to play?" And she chose My Way. So, but these are just brief photos of me, and that's the floor show, just growing up in this wonderful environment. Of course, now you don't experience like this anymore. You had to have a jacket to go into the dining room. There was a cover charge. There were people that waited hours to get in, and reservations were booked 6 months in advance. But I also remember that my parents became an influential member of the community, and they instilled in me and my siblings this spirit called philanthropy, giving back. It didn't have a name in those days. It was just being grateful. They remembered what it was like to suffer so much, to be so unwelcomed on Long Island, to not want Chinese people there on Long Island. There were no Chinese people there. So they decided to go the opposite direction and make hospitality, fanatical hospitality, their ethos, that everybody was welcomed. They fed everybody. They fought racism with love and food. So their business was empathy, giving back. And so my pathway to a business career started in that small little barn, was guided by the nightclub environment and inspired by this wonderful ethos and the courage of my ancestors. And so in closing, when I think about this book and think about how the Chinese were so vilified, and I was so committed to telling the story about these young kids, how they scurried out of China. They didn't leave voluntarily. They just escaped. And they grew up to be young entrepreneurs at that age. And they moved into their 50s as experts in their fields. And then into their twilight years, there is only one of those 6 siblings left today. And so I just wanted to close with honoring my other great-grandmother who's in the front. That is Kate's mother. We don't know very much about her, but she was responsible for Kate, who was, Kate was the first of her era to not have bound feet. Her mother, that little woman in the middle, refused to bind Kate's feet. She decided that she wanted her daughter to literally run free. And so that is the story of my elders. I'm so delighted to be here to share a little bit about that with you. Every family has a story. Every family has an inspirational story. I am so proud of mine, and I hope to someday grow up to be as accomplished as they are. So thank you for having me, and I'm happy to answer any questions or... So happy to answer any questions if you'd like, or call it a day, or what? Yes, Patty.
I think in your book you said your family might have been Chun, right?
We don't know. I don't know if Chinn is my real name. So because when my dad came off the boat, he was told, listen to somebody yelling the name of your village. Now he has no papers. There's no birth certificates for my father. Our name is spelled Chinn, and my father said that is how they spelled it in Seattle, to avoid the quota. They had 105 Chinese were allowed in the country, so he couldn't come in through San Francisco, which was the main port at the time. So some Chinese went to Seattle and changed their name to Chinn, but Americans couldn't pronounce it, so we just are the Chinns with 2 N's. And when you go to Seattle, you sometimes see old posters of Chinns that have 2 N's. Yes. Oh, do you have a question?
Actually, I was just curious if the last name Chinn is actually Paul Chinn. His uncle started the Chinn Restaurant and Hotel. I just wondered
C-H-I-N, right?
Yeah,
We don't know. My father sometimes spelled it. My father's on his draft card, he spells it with one N. So he just kind of played it loose. We have no idea. So I don't even know if that's. I have no idea whether that's my real name. We just cannot trace it back. But I knew that Hartwell started our family. That man with the beard. Yes.
This may seem off the subject, but I was wondering if you've ever seen Marvelous Maisel or Maisel.
No, I haven't.
You haven't? There's a relationship there with a woman who they're running a restaurant there sort of surreptitiously, and I think it's sort of a gambling
Yeah, I'd love to read it.
establishment. And when you're telling these stories, I was just imagining this place and all these people coming together and most of the people not knowing what was going on.
And really, they can't do this anymore. There are codes now. There are health codes. There's very rigid to open a restaurant. But I also tell in my story that I inherited my father's love of gambling because at Chinese New Year, as little kids, we would watch all the waiters and the cooks gamble, and if somebody won, they would give us a little money. So I learned how to read body language, and I learned that those who were had a bad hand, they would chew on the cigarette a little bit too much. So I started raking in a whole bunch of money as a little girl, and I made more money than the other kids babysitting. I thought, this is really wonderful. And so I just got paid for being cute, which I think is not a bad way to earn money. But as I got older, I learned how to read the cards, and it's a dangerous hobby. But it taught me as now I'm an arts executive, and it's taught me how to read body language. The things I learned by sitting at the bar at the age of 6 and selling cigarettes, that's kind of what you do as a nonprofit arts administrator. You have to. These came in handy eventually. And of course, I learned the art of small talk by sitting at the bar talking to all these adults. I mean, I didn't know what I was saying, but they would ask me things. I just engaged in conversation, and I sort of liked it after a while. So I grew up in this loud cacophony of noise, and that was, so for me, when I run theater companies and when I run arts organizations, I love the sound of people coming together. I've always tried to make a lobby like the restaurant. I always want to have food in there. I want to just hug people as they come in. But that's what my family did. My mother used to send me out to open the door when customers would come in, and for very special customers, to go greet them in the parking lot and open their car door.
Wow.
So that was what my brother, and we were little kids, so imagine how cute we were, and they were like, oh, you're so cute. They stayed longer. So my mother had a very sinister approach to raising children. But that's all we knew. And so the hard part of running a restaurant, for those you'd never get to see your family. My father, I never saw my father growing up because we would wake up for school, he'd be sleeping. I'd come home from school, he'd be at the restaurant. So the only time we saw each other was at the restaurant. And that's why, this family restaurant business is, as a caterer, very tough. You're on your feet all the time, and you're dripping in food, and it's exhausting. But I highly, highly recommend going into a family business because it's nothing like it. Jean.
Debbie, thank you. This just brings so much to life, and you tell an amazing story.
I don't hold a candle to you. I mean, you are just really the expert of Chinese history.
Our lives intersect in so many ways. Peter grew up, his dad had a bar restaurant in Harlem, so he grew up in Harlem with, similar but very different stories as a Greek kid growing up in Harlem in a black,
Yeah.
Greek restaurant. But I had a couple of questions. One's more historical and one's more personal. The first time I saw my mom drunk was at Trader Vic's in Hong
Oh boy.
My dad had my sister and me take her back to the hotel, and she ran around in her undies, which I had also never seen, doing the ad for deodorant, doing this little dance with the little hanky across her,
Yeah, you know, you couldn't fly to Hawaii. I mean, it took a long time to get to Hawaii, living on Long Island and thinking about going, even to California, let alone going to Hawaii. So I think that what they made in Manhattan was a bit of Polynesia there. I mean, I talked to former dancers who said that was where the Polynesians felt welcome. All the dancers, they shared routines. The bands shared repertoire. So there was a community of Polynesians in Manhattan at that time. As one of the dancers said to me, she said, we could never go to Hawaii because we just can't afford to live there. We can't move there. Our home base is here. So they made a Polynesian cultural center on Long Island, and there were other Polynesian restaurants on Long Island, not just ours. But my father and my mother always shared customers. If we were booked, they would send them to Bali High. But everybody was into this craze. I think it was because everything that I mentioned, South Pacific and Hawaii came out, and it was just a fascination. And really, when Disneyland started, everybody talked about that. Everybody, you got to go to Disneyland to see the exhibit there. And that was the whole craze at the time. There was Arthur Godfrey was doing his show back then. So there was just this, it was exotic, it was new, no one had ever heard about it. It was not tourist at the time. It truly, and we had in our Polynesian floor show, a woman who claimed to be of Hawaiian royalty. So we got the best of the group. And so the Hawaiian dancers they were recruited from Hawaii to come to Hawaii Kai. So they brought with them their original dances. They're not the ones that are made up. So that's why it was so popular. And it became a little kitschy as you know, Hawaii Kai became this mega center. But it was a fascination for all things Polynesia. You know, it was a brand new era in the United States of not knowing. No one knew about Samoa, and we did shows in Tahiti and Fiji, and nobody knew where they really were. It was magical. Yes.
Something that I think primed that earlier, my stepdad was Chinese, and his father was born of Chinese parents in Waipio Valley in Hawaii, and there were many others also. And in the 20s, as musicians, they toured the U.S. My step-grandpa met his future wife, who was the child of Danish immigrants, in Wisconsin on one of these tours.
Gosh.
And so, I mean, they went places that otherwise would not have seen
Yes.
anything Hawaiian. And so I think people maybe got a taste for it and were so thrilled when they got
Yeah.
more.
Yeah. I think so. Yeah.
Turner Ricks must have been national because I went to, at 17, went to Turner Ricks in Hawaii on one of my first dates and had the first
My time.
Mai Tai.
Your rite of passage.
Yeah,
Well, no one they didn't do decor like that. I mean, you think about the man of Frederick Fox who designed. He did stuff with the Met. He did the Show of Shows with Imogen Coco and Sid Caesar. He did that set. So they hired a guy that designed for the Metropolitan Opera to design Hawaii Kai, which is remarkable. So.
I think they just wanted people to be transported.
Yeah,
Completely different.
especially in a
Not
winter
spend all your money
a
here.
winter in New York, you want to just want to get out of there,
Yeah.
right?
Is your parents' restaurant still?
No, the restaurant is. I believe the building is still there. I'm now trying to save it from being demolished. But Long Island, Syosset, it's all now strip malls now. It's just sad, very sad. But when my father announced to my mother he was just going to sell the restaurant. He was just tired of doing it. My mother just was apoplectic about that because she didn't know. And so my parents had bought the property next door, which was originally going to be a motel or hotel, to have a true experience of dine at Mahjong and stay overnight at the hotel. So in New York, you don't want to have to travel in the winter. So the plan was to build that. But the neighborhood association protested that. They protested that it would be more Chinese people coming in, they had more Chinese cooks. We still dealt with a lot of NIMBY. But my father, in my book, I talk about my father's relentless efforts to get out of debt. So he worked with a franchise-friendly corporation, and they made it into a friendly ice cream shop.
Oh.
And my mother, in a spirit of defiance, applied for a job there, became a waitress. And and no one could say no to her because she was the landlord. And so she took it upon herself to run that like precision, because she was so mad at the friendly corporation because they were very sloppy. And I tell stories about how a customer would say, well, I have a coupon that says, if I don't get my meal served in 15 minutes, I'll get a free ice cream. And she'd say, don't bother, you're not gonna, here's the ice cream, it's never gonna happen. So she would scold people. She refused to serve people they left a small tip, which was really bad because she was the only waitress for breakfast. So she just refused to serve them. She just said, go away. She was really kind of a hothead. But then my father sold it to, it became a pizza place. Now it is a Coldwell Banker. It's chopped up. There's a realtor in the front and the back. There's a yoga shop, and it's all chopped up now, which is really a shame.
But the building's
So far, the building is still there. I don't know. I'm so far away that I don't know how to save it. But again, as I mentioned, there's no other building like it in the world. It was put together literally by hand. So, yeah. Jackie? Yes.
You have such an amazing family and such a story to it. I'm wondering if there's anyone else in your generation or the next who has such a keen curiosity and an interest in preserving, I guess, the family history.
Not a soul. I have all these cousins, and they are not really interested in preserving. This is one of the inspirations of it, because I wanted something to leave for my younger cousins, just something, because I don't have much assets, so they're just going to get this story. It's their inheritance. So I figure I'm going to just write this. And so that generation, they're now like 13, 17, 18 years old. They have gravitated to this. They're using this as their school project. And one of the boys, he's 17 years old, he wants to learn about the Chinese way of writing our name. And I thought, oh, great, he wants to learn how to write Chinese. No, he wants to get a tattoo. But that's okay, that's okay. But no, none of my cousins are remotely interested about this. So, and I don't know why. I just think it's so sad.
Can we turn it into a historical site, possibly?
Historical.
Your restaurant.
Historical site?
You know, I'm trying to figure out how to do that. And the thing is, I think it's just within the era where you can claim it historical. But I'm not there to champion for it. So that's the hard part. I'm trying to get on a book tour to go to Long Island and talk about this, because Long Island is no longer potato farms. It's just, there's strip malls. It looks like any horrified, outgrown suburb. There's no characteristic anymore.
Is there still a Chinese cultural center there?
There's a Chinese cultural center there. It's not as robust. That's one of the things is my parents, the restaurant was open every day except for 2 days. Chinese New Year, and prepare for Chinese New Year. And my parents would invite people they would pay, and all the proceeds went to the Chinese Cultural Center, which was designed to make sure that nobody forgot about Chinese culture. So my parents were very generous in supporting that center. I think it's still around. I don't know how potent it is.
I wonder if you could talk with them, maybe it could be
Good point.
a national landmark and on a tour.
National landmark,
definitely
yeah.
On a walking tour.
Yep,
Like,
absolutely, yeah. But, yes?
Early on, you mentioned the theme of the power of art through trauma.
Power of art through trauma.
Say a little bit more.
Well, yeah, so I talk about my mother and her siblings, about how they got through the bombing and the firing, and I tell the story about they were told to purge all of their pictures and books that could be perceived as anti-Japanese, and they burned them in the bathtub, which had a chimney, and the purging was relentless that the chimney broke down. Oh. And so my mother talked about what it was like to be so scared, 14 years old, so scared, that they just sang. They sang and they danced, and they remembered their poetry from 5 years old. And so there's a part of my book where I talk about what happened to me as a 13-year-old girl and the sudden closure of my childhood. And it was rather traumatic. It had to do with sexual abuse. And I remember as a young girl that there was no place to go. There was no YouTube, there's no place to go. And people didn't talk about that then. So it was a very lonely experience for me, and the trauma of surviving that sexual abuse that I went through. What I started to do is I started to hone in on singing, playing my piano, playing guitar. I joined the choir. I went deep into something inside me that rocked me to a place of healing. And as an adult, when I when I run theater companies and opera companies, I always try to put into the corpus of programming anything that will bring art to a hospital or community or service center or some. So my work with Anna Devere Smith is actually interesting because that's the work that we're doing together. But I've always tried to make sure that some form of a young community, particularly girls, are touched by the arts. It's just a powerful thing. When I was running the Carmel Bach Festival in Monterey, I started a program called Music in the Mind in partnership with the local hospital, Community Hospital of Monterey Peninsula, CHOMP is what they call it. And so they had a lot of members of the military that were coming in that were so traumatized by their experiences. So I introduced this program to use art therapy, art as a way of healing, to form a way of expressing and talking and getting through. I'm not a therapist, I'm not any kind of psychologist, but for me, what got me through, what got other people that I know through, was singing about it, dancing to it, just trying to get through, taking control of your own body. Any other questions or comments? Hi, Jackie. Good to see you. She runs the Arcata Playhouse. You know all about you know all about art and healing and good stuff.
I believe firmly in the arts as a healer.
Yep.
And social change.
Social change, yeah. Well, I guess if there are no other questions or yes, Auntie.
So, I love the part of the book when you talk about your dad developing recipes. And,
My dad developing recipes.
yeah, so did he leave behind any recipes?
No, there were no recipes. You just make stuff. You just throw stuff in there, you know. He was a chemist. Don't forget, he was a chemist. And he loved to work in the, it made him a great bartender, but he loved to experiment. All the cooks coming from China, they had no recipes. They just little of this, little of that. And there are no written recipes. They just, you know, the food is different because we source food differently, right? The mantra in the day growing up is leave all the fat on. Fat was very good for you. And so I keep hearing from people they have never had spare ribs like they had at our restaurant because we grow animals differently. You know, you just can't find pork like that anymore. And so the mahjong started to decline when the fad of dexatrim and there was all this, you know, the jazzercise that all started to come into the consciousness. But also what really triggered the demise of mahjong was when Nixon went to China and opened the borders, and so all of the other Chinese chefs from other provinces came out, and suddenly everybody wanted Szechuan food. And people would come into mahjong with hot sauce and say, could you put this on the dish? And my father said no, because my father's cuisine was Cantonese, which is, my father would say, any Chinese will tell you if they want good Chinese food, it's Cantonese food. So, but he refused to compromise. And so everybody was going to a sushi, so it was a whole craze. If you study culinary history in the United States, you know that when Nixon opened the borders of China and when the Vietnam War ended, Vietnamese food came in. So everybody started coming in with their cuisines. And so we no longer were the only Cantonese restaurant in the area. And my father decided just to close it while he was riding high. It had a 30-year run. So.
Did your father name the restaurant after the craze that was happening?
You know, we don't know because aunt told me, your father loved to gamble. No wonder he named the restaurant after a game. So, but my father loved to play mahjong. So, and I don't know if how he did. My father just decided to come up with all kinds of harebrained ideas. He was an entrepreneur. He loved to find the next phase. In my book, I talked about he was so into baked potatoes. He thought, I'm going to start something called Grater Tater, and I'm going to just have all different toppings. He was just so fascinated with baked potatoes. And that went nowhere, but that was before he discovered Polynesia. And he discovered that that was what I wanted to do. He was always concocting something. So, you know, he was just a man who just decided he just wanted to do his own thing. And my mother was along for the ride, and we kids came along for the ride. And I thought everybody had a restaurant when I was 5 years old. I thought everybody ate at a restaurant. I had no idea people ate in dining rooms at homes. It was so foreign to me. I had no idea. So it's so funny. And I thought every young kid gambled. I would go to school with coins and cards, and I want to play at recess. I know. Such issues. Yeah. So.
Turned out pretty good.
I turned out pretty good so far. Well, it has been such a joy being with you. Thank you for taking the time to be with us. Thank you for hosting. Thank you, Auntie. Thank you. Thank you.
We do have Debbie's book for sale here at
Oh, yeah.
$30.
Oh, here, Marilyn.
So we have Debbie's book for sale here. It's $30.
Yep.
And proceeds from the sales we are going to donate to the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Persons Fund. So
Yep.
supporting that.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Thank you. Thank you, Josh. Thank you.